The sun beats upon the broken plains of southern Iraq with a relentless fury, a hammer upon the anvil of time. Here, the air shimmers above dust that was once wall and temple, and the very ground cracks open as if trying to speak. For more than a century, scholars have bent over the clay fragments unearthed from this scorched earth, translating the wedge-shaped marks of the Sumerians. They believed they were reading the first chapter of human memory, the primordial story of a great flood that cleansed the world and began history anew. But what if this is not the beginning, but a final, fading echo? What if the deluge meticulously recorded in cuneiform script was not the first catastrophe, but merely the last one that remained within the fragile bounds of detailed narrative? The clay itself is an honest witness, it cannot lie, holding only the exact shape pressed into its damp surface before the fire of millennia hardened it. Yet the hands that guided the stylus were not those of eyewitnesses. They were the hands of scribes, generations removed, transcribing a story that was already ancient, a memory passed from parent to child across a gulf of time, carried from drowned coastlines to this river valley. Human memory is a strange and distorting medium, it layers, it compresses, it simplifies. And in its grand, tragic simplification, it often mistakes the last, most vivid catastrophe for the very first one, burying the truth of cyclical endings beneath the myth of a singular beginning. This landscape itself is a testament to impermanence. The Tigris and Euphrates, the lifeblood of Mesopotamia, have shifted their courses countless times, leaving behind paleo channels like ghostly rivers in the soil. The ruins of mighty cities like Uruk, and Eridu rise from the desert as stark, eroded mounds, tells each layer a generation's ambition turned to strata. It is in this context of deep, layered time that Leonard Woolley made his famed discovery. But to understand why that discovery was potentially a misinterpretation, we must first understand the weight of the story he sought to prove. The Sumerian flood myth, later refined in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh and echoed in the Hebrew story of Noah, is not a simple tale. It is a complex theological and cosmological narrative about divine displeasure, human imperfection, mercy, and rebirth. It carries the profound weight of explanation. It explains why the world is the way it is, why humanity exists under a kind of divine probation, and how civilization was granted a second chance. To find physical proof of such a story is to seemingly bridge the chasm between myth and history, to ground our deepest stories in the tangible world. Woolley's ambition was, therefore, monumental. He wasn't just digging for pottery, he was digging for the foundations of Western cultural memory. When his workers hit that clean layer of silt, he believed he had found the very floor of history, the canvas upon which the post-Diluvian world was painted. The world celebrated with him. But the earth, as it turns out, is a far more meticulous and less accommodating archivist than we are. It preserves not one narrative, but many, and they are often stacked in confounding, nonlinear ways. The simplicity of before and after is a human desire imposed upon a geological record that speaks of repetition, cycle, and resilience. The silence in that sterile silt was not the silence of a world waiting to begin, it was the temporary silence of a world holding its breath, of life scoured from one place only to persist stubbornly in another, both below and beyond. The story pressed into clay was a plea against oblivion, a desperate attempt to fix a memory that was already slipping into the realm of archetype. And archetypes, by their nature, are timeless and recurrent. The flood in the tablets was, perhaps, always meant to be more than a single event, it was a category of experience, a dark phase in the cycle of the world that the Sumerians knew, in their bones, could come again. The modern search for this flood began not with an open question, but with a fervent desire for confirmation. In the 1920s and 30s, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley descended into the royal tombs and ziggurat mounds of Ur, armed with the tools of his trade and a singular, driving obsession, to find material proof for the biblical deluge, to anchor faith in the unyielding reality of soil and stone. And for a glorious moment, the earth itself seemed to confess. Roughly 8 feet down, his local workmen struck something that made their tools fall silent, a clean, sharp, and startlingly distinct band of pure silt. It was over 2 meters thick in places, a sterile layer of water-laid clay, devoid of any human trace, no pottery shards, no tools, no bones. It was as if a divine hand had wiped the slate clean. Above this line lay the majestic ruins of Sumerian Ur, with its gold-laden tombs and towering ziggurat. Below it, emerging from the mud, were the artifacts of a different, older culture, later identified as the Ubaid period people. Woolley wired the world with triumphant certainty. He had found the flood layer, the geological boundary between antediluvian and post-diluvian worlds. Newspapers from London to New York trumpeted the discovery as ultimate proof. Museums curated exhibits around this definitive line in the soil. For decades, that stratum of sterile silt stood as the accepted divide across human history. The moment before ended and after began. Woolley's interpretation was elegant and satisfying. It fit a Western historical mindset that cherished clear demarcations: the fall of Rome, the discovery of America, the Industrial Revolution. History was a series of transformative events. The flood fit perfectly as the ultimate transformative event. His find at Ur seemed to provide the physical correlative to the mythic and religious texts. It allowed scholars to point to a specific layer in a specific trench and say, "Here. This is when it happened." This concretization of myth had immense power. It made the story real, historical, and therefore somehow safer, a past event, contained and understood. The flood was no longer a terrifying, recurring metaphor for chaos, it was a dated incident. However, Woolley's methodology, though advanced for his time, was inherently limited by his focus. He was excavating a single city, Ur, and his interpretation was heavily influenced by his desire to link it to the biblical narrative. He saw what he was primed to see, a clean break. He paid less attention to the nature of what lay beneath the silt, other than to note it was different. The Ubaid material was, to him, simply the before picture. The possibility that this before picture represented not a primitive precursor but a fully realized and sophisticated culture in its own right did not fit the clean break narrative. Furthermore, the archaeology of Mesopotamia was in its infancy. The sheer depth of time and the complexity of stratification were not yet fully appreciated. The tendency was to see cultural development as linear and progressive, simple to complex. A catastrophic flood that wiped out the simple people, Ubaid, and made way for the advanced people, Sumerians, was a perfect storyline. It took the patience of later archaeologists, armed with more refined techniques like radiocarbon dating and a less teleological view of history, to revisit these trenches and ask different questions. They began to wonder, if this flood was so total, why did the same cultural practices, religious motifs, and even settlement patterns persist, albeit evolved, on both sides of the silt layer? The break was not as absolute as it seemed. The silt was a dramatic intermission, not the end of the play. And as they dug deeper, literally and figuratively, they began to find that the play had many more acts than previously imagined, and that this intermission happened not at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle of a much longer performance. Yet the earth is a librarian who keeps multiple editions of the same apocalyptic text. Archaeology, in its patient, impersonal way, has a habit of complicating human certainty. As the 20th century wore on, other teams returned to the trenches of Ur and other great tells, Kish, Shuruppak, and most importantly, Eridu. They dug deeper, driven by curiosity rather than confirmation. Beneath Woolley's celebrated flood layer, they expected to find only the crude, tentative beginnings of human society, post-holes of transient camps, flakes of flint, the simple debris of a species just learning to settle. What they found instead silenced them with its profound implications. They found cities. Not mere hovels, but organized architecture, foundations laid with precision, streets that met at right angles, drainage systems, and storage complexes. They found graves with orderly rows of bodies accompanied by grave goods, and pottery of sophisticated design. Most tellingly, at Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves venerated as the very first, excavators peeled back not one or two, but 18 distinct layers of rebuilding, one atop the other like pages in a millennia-long ledger. The deepest, most foundational layer was carbon dated to approximately 5400 BC. This was over 2,000 years before the flood layer Woolley had identified. The conclusion was inescapable and quietly revolutionary: the famous flood was not an origin point. It was a devastating, but non-terminal, interruption. Civilization was not born from the receding waters, it was already ancient, complex, and networked when those waters rose. The significance of Eridu cannot be overstated. In Sumerian mythology, Eridu was not just a city, it was the first city, created by the gods before the institution of kingship descended from heaven. It was the home of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. To find that its physical remains stretched back so far, and showed such clear continuity of sacred site, each temple rebuilt directly atop the previous one on the same alignment, was to find a thread of cultural memory that predated the flood by epochs. This was not a people who started from scratch after a disaster, this was a people who remembered, who consciously rebuilt their holiest site in the exact same sacred spot, generation after generation, disaster after disaster. The flood layer at Ur, and similar ones found at other sites like Shuruppak, the city associated with the Sumerian Noah figure, Ziusudra, now took on a different character. They were not global boundaries, but evidence of massive, recurring regional catastrophes in a flood-prone river delta. The Tigris and Euphrates are notorious for their violent, unpredictable floods. A perfect confluence of extreme weather, snowmelt from the Taurus and Zagros mountains, and possible tectonic shifts could have produced floods of exceptional magnitude, capable of burying cities under meters of silt. These were the floods that entered the living memory of the Sumerian civilization. But the myth of the flood, the one about the total destruction of the world, seemed to carry a deeper, older dread. The archaeological record was revealing a paradox. The historical floods were severe but local, while the mythical flood was cosmic and absolute. This gap between the physical evidence and the narrative scale hinted that the myth was not a simple magnification of a local event. It was a separate memory altogether, one that had been grafted onto the historical experience of river flooding. The Earth's testimony was clear: civilization in Mesopotamia was resilient and old. The myth's testimony was clear: humanity had once faced an absolute, world-ending aquatic catastrophe. The challenge was to reconcile these two truths. This seismic shift in understanding cracks open a chasm of unsettling questions. If vibrant, organized cities with temples, trade, and technology thrived for millennia before the Mesopotamian flood, then what, precisely, did that flood end? If the Sumerian tablets describe a cataclysm of absolute totality, the flood swept over, the world was destroyed, the foundations of the earth were lost, were they merely exaggerating a regional disaster? Or is there a more profound disconnect between the event we found and the memory they preserved? The clay tablets do not exaggerate, they simply preserve. But when a Sumerian scribe, around 2100 BC, pressed the story of the righteous man Ziusudra and his divinely commanded boat into wet clay, he was not recording current events. He was copying a text that was already centuries old, which itself was a written version of an oral tradition millennia older. The memory had been passed down through perhaps 100 generations. In such a vast relay of storytelling, details blur, timelines collapse, and separate events can merge. The terrifying possibility arises: the flood Woolley found in his trench, a massive but local inundation of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley around 2900 BC, was not the flood of Sumerian legend. It was simply the last, most recent one to occur within the era of their own civilization. The cataclysm described in their epic poetry, the one that truly returned the earth to its beginning, might refer to something else entirely: an older, vaster, more foundational drowning whose survivors became the ancestors of those who would later call themselves Sumerians. This forces us to re-examine the nature of the Sumerian civilization itself. Were they true originators, or were they brilliant inheritors? Their own king lists speak of kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood, which scholars dismiss as mythological. But what if these fantastical numbers are a distorted memory of a different kind of time, a deep time that belonged to a forgotten predecessor culture? The Sumerians appear in history quite suddenly with a fully formed writing system, complex bureaucracy, advanced astronomy, and sophisticated religious institutions. This Sumerian problem has long puzzled historians. The theory of a pre-Sumerian, now submerged source culture provides a compelling, if elusive, answer. If the Sumerians were the descendants of refugees from a drowned coastal civilization, they would have arrived in the river valley with a pre-packaged suite of advanced knowledge. They would have possessed the myth of the Great Flood as their central, defining trauma, the event that destroyed their original world. Then, as they built their new cities in Mesopotamia, they would have experienced the region's own fierce floods. Over centuries, the two narratives, the ancestral, epic-ending flood of saltwater and the recurring, regional floods of river water, would have fused. The specific details of the local floods, which mountain the boat landed on, the name of the righteous king, would become the specific details of the now combined myth. The unsettling question, therefore, transforms from "did the flood happen?" to "which flood are we talking about?" And more profoundly, what forgotten world did the first flood actually end? The search for answers leads us out of the Mesopotamian mud and into the realm of global geology and the lost landscapes of the last ice age. The clues to this deeper past are not always in the explicit plot, but in the subtle grammar of the ancient texts themselves. Among the oldest fragments we possess is the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian creation and flood narrative. It tells the familiar story: the gods decide to destroy noisy humanity with a flood, the god Enki warns the mortal Ziusudra to build a boat, the deluge rages for 7 days and nights, and Ziusudra survives to offer sacrifice. Yet scholars like Miguel Civil have pointed out the peculiar, haunting phrasing in the original Sumerian. The text uses grammatical forms and words that imply repetition. It speaks of cities being destroyed once more, of mankind being judged again, of the waters rising as before. These are not the linguistic constructions one uses for a singular, unprecedented event. They are the language of cycle, of return, of a pattern known and feared. It is as if the scribe, perhaps unconsciously, was encoding a truth older than the specific story he was telling. This has happened before. This is not the first time the world has been scrubbed clean by water. This grammatical echo suggests the Sumerian flood story is not a unique historical record, but a specific iteration of a template for catastrophe, a template etched into cultural memory by repeated trauma across epochs. This notion of cyclical catastrophe is deeply embedded in Mesopotamian cosmology. They did not view time as a linear arrow but as a circle, or more accurately, as a series of cycles governed by the movements of the stars and the whims of the gods. Each cycle contained the potential for renewal and destruction. The flood myth fits perfectly into this worldview as the ultimate reset mechanism. But the grammar of the Eridu Genesis implies that this reset button had been pressed more than once. This aligns with other Mesopotamian traditions that spoke of multiple worlds or ages before the current one. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic, which includes a flood story, begins with a period when lesser gods were forced to labor, leading to the creation of humans to take over the work, a different kind of world before the flood world. This layered view of history is crucial. It suggests the Sumerians and their successors were aware, at some level, that their civilization was not the first attempt at order. There was a before the before. The flood that divided their king list was the most recent division, not the first. This cyclical grammar extends to their astronomical and mathematical systems. Their base 60-numeral system is ideal for tracking recurring celestial cycles. Their obsessive divination practices were attempts to discern the patterns of the gods' recurring moods and interventions. Their entire intellectual framework was designed to predict and manage cycles, of seasons, of kings, of celestial events, and, perhaps, of catastrophic floods. The flood myth, therefore, was not just a story about the past, it was a warning about the future. It was a narrative expression of their deepest cosmological belief, that order is temporary, chaos is always lurking, and the waters may rise again. The grammatical tick of repetition is the fingerprint of a culture that lived with this as a central, terrifying truth. This notion of a deeper, cyclically returning catastrophe finds its most bizarre expression in the Sumerian king list. This cuneiform document, treated by the ancients with bureaucratic seriousness, lists the rulers of Sumer from the very beginning of kingship after it descended from heaven. Its pre-flood section is a chronicle of the impossible. It names 8 kings who ruled from 5 different cities. Their reigns are not measured in decades, but in tens of thousands of years. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, Alalgar for 36,000, and Menluana for 43,200. Combined, these antediluvian monarchs reigned for a staggering 241,200 years. Then, a single, stark line, the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descends again, but the reign lengths, while still superhuman, are drastically shorter, 1,200 years, 900 years, eventually dwindling to the historical scale of decades. Scholars have long debated these numbers, dismissing them as mythology, symbolic astronomy, or propaganda. But what if they represent a different kind of truth, the truth of distorted memory? What if these impossibly long reigns are not measurements of years, but metaphors for the immense, forgotten depth of time before a foundational catastrophe? The flood in the king list may not be Woolley's flood, but a conceptual boundary, a marker for the collapse of a prior age of the world so distant that its timeline could only be expressed in the language of myth. The list structure, eons of order, a cataclysmic reset, then a new order with shorter cycles, feels less like bad history and more like a cultural memory of geological time itself. Interpreting the king list requires a shift from literalism to hermeneutics. One compelling theory is that the numbers are not solar years, but are derived from the Sumerian sexagesimal system applied to astronomical cycles. For example, 36,000 is a fundamental number in Mesopotamian astronomy. Yet, even if the numbers are symbolic, their sheer magnitude before the flood and their dramatic reduction after it is highly significant. It encodes a profound sense of loss, a fall from a golden age of incredibly long, stable cycles, perhaps a memory of a stable, pre-catastrophe climate or society, into a fallen age of shorter, more turbulent cycles. This mirrors the geological reality. The end of the last ice age around 11,700 years ago marked the transition from the long, stable, cold Pleistocene epoch to the shorter cycled, warmer, but more climatically volatile Holocene epoch in which we live. Human civilizations have risen and fallen within these Holocene cycles. The king list, in its own mythic way, might be encoding this very transition. The pre-flood kings represent the long, mythic time of the Pleistocene, when human societies, perhaps coastal ones, existed in a different environmental context. The flood represents the violent transition, the meltwater pulses, the rising seas. The post-flood kings with their shrinking reigns represent the new, accelerated time of the Holocene, the age of agriculture, cities, and rapid civilizational rise and fall. Thus, the king list is not a record of Sumerian kings at all, but a profound philosophical and chronological document. It is an attempt to reconcile the deep, almost unfathomable past of humanity learned through oral tradition, with the recent, documented past of city-states. It places the Sumerian civilization within a cosmic timeline, acknowledging that they are newcomers in a very old world. The flood is the hinge between the unknowable deep past and the knowable historical past. Woolley's flood silt was a real event, but it was merely a later, smaller echo of the cosmological hinge point memorialized in the king list. To find evidence for a flood older than Sumer, we must look beyond their river valley to the shape of the world itself. Around 20,000 years ago, at the peak of the last ice age, global sea levels were approximately 120 meters, nearly 400 feet, lower than they are today. What this means is staggering. Vast stretches of continental shelf now under ocean waves were dry, habitable land. Coastlines were dozens, even hundreds of miles farther out. The Persian Gulf, which today laps at the shores of Iraq and Iran, did not exist. It was a fertile, river-fed basin, often called the Gulf Oasis by paleoclimatologists, watered by the extended Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and other rivers, which joined into a single mighty river flowing through the valley and emptying into the Indian Ocean far to the south, near the Strait of Hormuz. This was not barren desert, but a potentially lush and inviting landscape for human settlement, a flat, water-rich plain ideal for foraging and early experimentation with plant cultivation. Then, the ice began to melt. From about 14,000 to 7,000 BC, the seas rose in fits and starts, sometimes slowly, sometimes in rapid surges from collapsing ice sheets in North America and Scandinavia. These meltwater pulses could raise sea levels by several meters per century. The Persian Gulf basin filled. The Indian Ocean marched northward, drowning the valley, its waters advancing perhaps a kilometer per year, swallowing forever any communities that clung to its shores. By around 6,000 BC, the Gulf looked roughly as it does today. This was not a flood in the Mesopotamian sense of a sudden, violent river overflow. It was a slow-motion, generational drowning of an entire world, a flood that took 7,000 years. Its survivors had only one direction to flee, inland, up the very river valleys that would later become the heartland of Sumer. This scenario is not mere speculation. Core samples from the floor of the Persian Gulf show layers of river silt and peat, indicating terrestrial land. Sonar mapping has revealed the paleo channels of the ancient river system on the seabed, a ghostly map of a lost world. While direct archaeological evidence of settlements remains underwater and largely unexplored, the logic is compelling. We know that humans during this period, the Neolithic, were adept at exploiting rich riverine and coastal environments. Sites like Jericho, in the Levant, and Catalhoyuk, in Anatolia, show complex sedentary life by 9000 BC. It is almost inconceivable that the fertile, well-watered Gulf oasis would have been empty. It was likely a prime habitat. As the waters rose, these communities would have been pushed back, again and again, over generations. They would have carried with them their knowledge, their stories, and their technology. This forced migration would have funneled populations into the narrower river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, increasing population density and potentially catalyzing the move toward more intensive agriculture and social complexity, the very conditions that gave rise to Sumerian civilization. The drowning of the Gulf Oasis provides a plausible, geologically documented, Great Flood event that is both real and of sufficient scale to inspire a myth of world-ending proportions. It was a flood that didn't just inundate a valley, it erased an entire geographical region the size of Great Britain, turning land into sea. For its inhabitants, it truly was the end of their world. Imagine the legacy of those who fled the rising Gulf. They were not primitive nomads. To settle a rich river basin, they would have possessed knowledge of water management, seasonal cycles, plant cultivation, and social organization. As the saltwater inexorably claimed their homes, they retreated north, carrying with them not just physical possessions, but an entire cultural and technological toolkit, and a defining, traumatic memory. The central, shaping event of their history became, the water rose and took everything. We escaped to the high ground. When they eventually settled in new locations, like the site that would become Eridu, what did they build first? Not palaces or granaries, but temples. And not to any god, but specifically to Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and the subterranean ocean, Abzu. This was the deity of the life-giving waters beneath the earth, in stark contrast to the salt water that had destroyed their world. Eridu's earliest shrine, dating to that foundational date of 5400 BC, was a simple reed hut dedicated to Enki, positioned facing the southeast, directly toward the advancing Persian Gulf. It reads as an act of propitiation and remembrance by refugees from a drowned homeland, honoring the benevolent power of fresh water while forever memorializing the destructive power of the sea. This refugee hypothesis explains several puzzling aspects of early Sumerian culture. First, it explains the sudden appearance of relatively complex society at sites like Eridu and the Ubaid period sites. It wasn't a spontaneous invention, it was a transplantation and concentration of pre-existing knowledge into a new, confined environment. Second, it explains the Sumerians' obsessive focus on water control, their elaborate irrigation canals, dikes, and water-lifting devices. This wasn't just agricultural necessity, it was a cultural imperative born of trauma. Controlling water was the difference between life and a return to chaos. Third, it explains the central place of Enki in their pantheon. Enki was not a warrior king like Enlil, he was a clever, benevolent god who saved humanity by warning Ziusudra of the flood. He was the god of the Abzu, the fresh water under the earth, the safe, controllable water. This aligns perfectly with a people who revered the source of life-giving fresh water while fearing the destructive salt water of the sea. Fourth, it provides a plausible origin for the Sumerian language itself, which is a linguistic isolate, it has no known relatives. Some linguists speculate it could be the language of a pre-existing population absorbed or displaced by Semitic-speaking peoples later. Could it be the language of the Gulf Oasis refugees? The legacy of these imagined refugees is woven into the very fabric of Sumer, in their first city, their primary god, their most defining myth, and their most urgent technological pursuit. They were a civilization founded on the memory of loss, driven by the determination to never be victims of water again. Human memory, especially collective, cultural memory, functions not as a pristine recording, but as a palimpsest, a parchment where older writings are imperfectly erased to make room for new ones, with ghostly traces of the original always bleeding through. The Sumerian flood narrative is likely such a palimpsest. The oldest, deepest layer is the traumatic, ancestral memory of the post-glacial sea level rise, the drowning of the Gulf Oasis and other coastal plains worldwide. This was the truly global, epic-ending event that affected humanity broadly. Over millennia, as the descendants of those refugees built the Sumerian civilization, this memory remained, but its details faded into the archetypal, the Great Flood. Then, around 2900 BC, a very real, massive, and devastating fluvial flood occurred in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, inundating cities like Shuruppak and leaving Woolly's clean silt layer at Ur. This recent, visceral disaster overwrote the older, vaguer memory. The two events, the ancient, slow coastal drowning and the recent, violent river flood, fused in the cultural consciousness. The specific details of the historical river flood, the boat, the survival, the local mountains, were grafted onto the older, grander template of the world-ending deluge. The result was the hybrid, supremely powerful myth that was written down, a specific story carrying the emotional and cosmic weight of a far deeper past. This process of palimpsestic memory is evident in the layers of the myth itself. In the earliest Sumerian fragments, Ziusudra is simply a king of Shuruppak who is granted eternal life. In the later Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, the flood hero Utnapishtim, the Akkadian version of Ziusudra, gives a detailed, almost technical description of building the boat. I drew its design on the ground, I gave it 6 decks, I divided it into 7 compartments. This reads like a memory of actual boat-building technology, possibly from the historical river flood period. Yet the cosmic scale of the event, all of mankind had returned to clay, the landscape was as level as a flat roof, speaks to the older, oceanic memory. The mountain where the boat lands also shifts, the Sumerian text mentions simply a mountain, while the Babylonian version names Mount Nimish, and the biblical version names the mountains of Ararat. These are specific, known locations in the Mesopotamian/Anatolian region, anchoring the story in the geography of the historical flood area. The older, coastal flood memory had no such specific mountain, the high ground was simply inland. The palimpsest shows clearly the specific, localized details, boat design, mountain name, are the newer writing. The universal, catastrophic scale, total destruction, world-covering waters, is the older, faded script showing through. This fusion made the myth incredibly resilient and portable. It was specific enough to feel real and local, yet universal enough to be adopted and adapted by other cultures who had their own memories of floods, whether from river valleys, tsunamis, or glacial melt. The Sumerian myth became the master template because it most eloquently expressed this dual-layered memory. The proof that the Sumerian story is not isolated, but taps into a primal human memory, is found in its eerie global resonance. Cultures with no conceivable contact with ancient Mesopotamia tell structurally identical stories. The Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, the Hebrew tale of Noah, the Greek myth of Deucalion, the Hindu story of Manu and the fish, the Aztec legend of Nada and Nina, the Hopi narrative of Spider-Woman saving people from a flood, the Chinese myth of Great Yu who controlled the floods, all share the core elements: divine displeasure, or a natural cycle's end, a warned righteous individual, a survival vessel, boat, ark, chest, gourd, hollow reed, a universal drowning, a mountain landing, and a rebirth of humanity or a covenant for a new world. The sheer ubiquity argues against simple cultural diffusion from a single source like Mesopotamia. Instead, it suggests that many human communities around the world independently experienced catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age as ice dams burst, glacial lakes drained, and seas rushed onto continental shelves. These were not the same flood, but a global syndrome of floods, a planetary event with countless local expressions. From the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin, from Australia to Scandinavia, myths describe rising waters covering the land. Aboriginal Australian stories, for instance, accurately describe coastlines that were flooded over 10,000 years ago, details preserved in oral tradition for hundreds of generations. The Inuit have stories of a time when the sea rose suddenly. In the Americas, flood myths are among the most common creation narratives. This global pattern points to a shared experience in humanity's deep past. The end of the Pleistocene was not a gentle transition. It was punctuated by catastrophic events like the draining of glacial Lake Agassiz in North America, which could have caused sudden, massive floods and sea level jumps. The Storegga slide off Norway around 6100 BC caused a massive tsunami that devastated coastlines as far away as Scotland. For coastal and riverine peoples everywhere, the millennia following the Ice Age were a time of profound environmental instability and threat from water. Each culture processed its own regional trauma into story, using the same basic narrative template because the experience was fundamentally the same: an unstoppable force of water claiming the known world, a desperate struggle for survival, and a painful new beginning. The Sumerians were not the originators of the flood myth, they were simply the first to inscribe one version of it into a durable medium that survived. Their story resonates because it is a particularly well-crafted example of a universal human memory. It gives a name, Ziusudra/Utnapishtim, a god, Enki/Ye, and a location, Mesopotamia, to an experience that was, in reality, nameless, causeless, and global. In doing so, they provided a vessel that other cultures could recognize and fill with their own details, which is precisely what happened as their stories spread through trade and conquest. But the core memory belongs to all of us. This theory presents a profound, almost frustrating, archaeological challenge. If the first, true, flood was the post-glacial sea level rise drowning coastal settlements, the primary evidence for the societies that endured it lies at the bottom of the sea. The most fertile, attractive lands for early humans during the Ice Age were the now submerged continental shelves and river basins. Any settlements in the Persian Gulf Basin, the Sundaland Shelf of Southeast Asia, which connected islands into a continent called Sunda, the Sahul Shelf north of Australia, or the Beringia land bridge are currently under tens of meters of water and millennia of marine sediment. They are, for now, largely inaccessible to conventional archaeology. This creates a frustrating gap in the record, a missing chapter of human prehistory. We see sophisticated societies like Eridu, Jericho, and Catalhoyuk appearing seemingly suddenly around 9000 to 5000 BC with developed rituals, agriculture, and social complexity. Were they spontaneous inventions, or were they the culmination of cultural developments that occurred over thousands of years on landscapes that are now lost to the ocean? This silence in the trenches on land is, paradoxically, loud evidence. The rapid pace of sea level rise, sometimes meters per century, would have left little time for people to salvage heavy materials. Structures would have been made of perishable wood, reed, and mud, which would have dissolved or been buried under marine deposits. The evidence is there, but it's underwater, requiring marine archaeology, which is exponentially more difficult and expensive than land archaeology. Some tantalizing clues have emerged. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Khumbat, sonar images have shown what appear to be geometric structures and drainage systems at depths of 30 to 40 meters, though these are highly controversial. In the North Sea, dubbed Doggerland, trawlers have for decades pulled up mammoth bones and prehistoric tools from the seafloor, proof of human habitation on that drowned plain. The silence on land, therefore, is not an absence of evidence, but evidence of absence, the absence of the original stage upon which a crucial act of the human drama was played. It forces us to extrapolate. We must look at the refugees' legacy in the first post-glacial cultures and reason backwards. The sudden appearance of advanced skills, like the megalithic architecture of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, circa 9600 BC, suggests a pre-existing knowledge base. Could the builders of Göbekli Tepe be descendants of people from a lost coastal culture, now expressing their complex cosmology in stone on a safe hilltop? The silence challenges the traditional cradle of civilization narrative that places it solely in river valleys. It suggests the cradles may have been on the coasts first, and the river valleys were the secondary nurseries where civilization, displaced and concentrated, truly flourished. Until we can extensively explore these submerged landscapes, the full story of the first flood and the world it ended will remain partially hidden, its truth echoing only in myth and in the unexplained sophistication of the earliest known cultures on dry land. Faced with the loss of their terrestrial home, what would refugees cling to? The land shifts and drowns, but the sky remains constant. The survivors of drowned coastlines may have carried with them not just stories of water, but sophisticated knowledge of the one thing that didn't change, the heavens. This might explain one of Sumer's most enduring and mysterious legacies, its base 60 numerical system, sexagesimal. Why 60? It is a number exquisitely suited to tracking celestial cycles. It is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it perfect for calculating fractions of orbits and seasons. From this system, we inherited the 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. This was not a random choice. It speaks of a culture obsessed with precise, long-term astronomical observation, likely for agricultural and ritual calendars. Such knowledge requires stable observation over centuries. Did the Sumerians develop this independently, or did they inherit the refined, sky-based mathematics of a much older, coastal people who needed the predictable stars to navigate and survive after their world was washed away? The heavens may be the unspoken archive of that lost world. The Sumerian, and later Babylonian, astronomical achievements were staggering. They identified the planets, tracked the movements of the sun and moon, developed a lunar calendar, and recognized the cycle of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, thousands of years before the Greeks. The MUL.APN tablets are essentially advanced astronomical handbooks. This knowledge seems to appear fully formed. The theory of a refugee culture provides a context. A coastal, seafaring people would have had an even greater need for astronomy for navigation than a river-based agricultural society. Knowledge of star positions, tides, linked to the moon, and seasonal cycles would have been critical for survival on coastlines and during migration. When forced inland, they would have brought this celestial toolkit with them. The Sumerian ziggurats themselves, often described as stairways to heaven, were not just temples, they were likely astronomical observatories. The orientation of many Mesopotamian temples to celestial events supports this. This transferred knowledge could also explain the Sumerian preoccupation with astrology and divination. If the world could be destroyed by a seemingly capricious event like the flood, then understanding the patterns of the gods in the sky became a desperate attempt to predict and avert future calamities. The sky was the one reliable text, and learning to read it was a matter of existential security. Thus, the Sumerians' profound astronomical legacy may be the clearest, most tangible artifact we have of the lost pre-flood world. It is a legacy not of pottery or architecture, but of abstract, sophisticated thought, a system for understanding time and space that was so robust it survived the drowning of its creator's homeland and became the foundation for later science. The sky, then, is where the memory of the drowned world was most successfully preserved, encoded not in stories of destruction, but in the precise, eternal mathematics of the cosmos. Sometimes, the past whispers not in grand epics, but in small, incongruous artifacts and persistent cultural motifs. Consider the bandudu, the Sumerian bucket. It is frequently depicted in the hands of winged genies or kings, engaged in a ritual called the water libation. They are shown dipping this bucket into a small, stylized container and sprinkling sacred water onto the ground or onto a sacred tree. Art historians interpret this as a fertility rite, ensuring the life-giving power of water for crops. But could its deeper resonance be one of atonement and reversal? Could this ritual of carefully, reverently pouring out life-giving fresh water be a symbolic reversal and propitiation of the catastrophic, saltwater flood that defined their ancestral past? Every careful pour a plea, let the waters be gentle, let them give life, not take it. Similarly, the intense Sumerian focus on divination, reading the will of the gods in sheep livers, extispacy, celestial omens, and dreams, speaks of a desperate need to discern patterns in a seemingly capricious universe, to avoid being blindsided by divine wrath again. Their entire worldview seems shaped by the trauma of a capricious, watery chaos barely held at bay by ritual and order. Another whisper lies in the very symbol of Enki, their savior god. He is often shown with two streams of water flowing from his shoulders or from a vase he holds, streams filled with swimming fish. These represent the Tigris and Euphrates. But why is the god of wisdom and fresh water the central figure in the flood myth? Because in a world traumatized by salt water, the god of fresh water becomes the ultimate hero and protector. His domain, the Absu, was the subterranean ocean of fresh water, the source of springs and wells. This was the antithesis of the destructive saltwater sea, Tiamat. The Sumerians' foundational myth, the Enuma Elish, tells of the god Marduk defeating the primordial saltwater goddess Tiamat and creating the world from her body. Order from watery chaos. This repeats the theme on a cosmic scale. Even their architecture whispers of this duality. The ziggurat was a symbolic mountain, a place of safety from floodwaters, a bridge to the gods, and a recreation of the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of creation at the beginning of time. Every ziggurat was a reenactment of survival and rebirth. These artifacts and symbols, when viewed through the lens of a flood trauma culture, cohere into a powerful statement. They are not just artistic or religious expressions, they are the psychological footprint of a people defined by a catastrophic memory. The bucket, the liver model, the flowing vase, the towering ziggurat, all are artifacts of a civilization in a sustained conversation with its own near annihilation, constantly working to ritually appease, technologically control, and cosmologically explain the power of water. The myth was the overt story, these artifacts were the daily, lived practice of remembering and managing that story's enduring terror. The Sumerian civilization itself ultimately fell, not to water, but to conquest, drought, and shifting political sands. They were absorbed by the Akkadians, then the Babylonians and Assyrians. Their cities were abandoned and buried by the very silt their rivers carried. Their language fell silent, becoming a learned tongue for priests, much like Latin. But their clay tablets endured in the dry earth, waiting. When Leonard Woolley brushed the dirt off that sterile flood layer nearly 4,000 years later, he believed he had found the beginning of the story. He had, in fact, found a later chapter. The true beginning lies deeper, both in the ground and in time. It lies in the slow, global drowning that forced humanity inward, upriver, seeding the fertile crescents and river valleys where the great early civilizations would later bloom. Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, all may be secondary civilizations, built by the descendants of those who fled the primary, coastal cradles of humanity now lost beneath the waves. The Sumerian flood myth, therefore, is a profound bridge. It is the specific memory of a local disaster serving as the vessel for the ancestral, species-level memory of a planetary transformation. It connects the historical to the geological, the written word to the oral tradition that stretches back to the very dawn of the Holocene epoch. This understanding closes a symbolic cycle. The Sumerians, through their writing, gave form to the memory of the flood. Archaeology, millennia later, found evidence of a flood and initially mistook it for the flood. Now, by combining the textual evidence, the archaeological record, and the geological data, we are beginning to see the full, layered picture. The cycle of memory is complete, from experience, to oral tradition, to written myth, to buried evidence, to scientific excavation, to reinterpretation. The Sumerians' greatest gift may not have been the wheel, writing, or cities, but this very lesson in the longevity and transformation of memory. They teach us that history is not a single line but a braid of threads, some of which originate in depths we can barely fathom. Their story warns us that the ground beneath our feet is not as stable as we think, that civilizations are fragile things built upon the scars of older disasters. And in doing so, they force us to look at our own place in the cycle. Their civilization ended. The ones after them ended. The flood layer they experienced was not the first. The haunting question their legacy leaves us with is, will the next great flood be the one that enters the mythic memory of a future civilization? Will they, digging in our silt, mistake our localized climate disasters for the catastrophe, unaware of the deeper, slower-moving deluge of planetary change that we are currently living through? This ancient story holds an urgent, uncomfortable mirror to our present. We too live in an age of rising seas. Our glaciers are melting, our ice sheets are destabilizing, and our coastlines are incrementally, inexorably retreating. Miami floods on sunny days, Pacific islands are being erased, and climate models project meters of sea level rise in the coming centuries, a pace that could rival the post-glacial meltwater pulses. We watch this unfold, often thinking of it as an unprecedented, man-made crisis. But the Sumerian tablets suggest a different perspective. We have been here before. Not in the specifics of causation, anthropogenic versus natural, but in the fundamental human experience of watching the water claim the land. The ancestors of the Sumerians lived through the last great global inundation. They survived it, fled from it, and built a new world upon its memory. Their legacy is a testament not to how civilization begins with a clean slate, but to how it persists through catastrophe, carrying forward the seeds of knowledge, story, and warning. The reflection is chillingly precise. Like the inhabitants of the Gulf Oasis, billions of people today live on vulnerable coastlines and river deltas, are modern, dense, technological, coastal civilizations. Our response, however, differs. The ancient refugees had the space to migrate inland. Our world is full, with political borders and immense populations. Migration on that scale today would trigger unprecedented upheaval. Yet, the Sumerian example also offers a sliver of hope. They did not just flee, they remembered, and they used that memory to build a culture obsessed with managing water and discerning patterns. They turned trauma into a driver of innovation, irrigation, astronomy, and a source of profound cultural meaning, myth, ritual. Our challenge is greater, for we understand the causation. We are not passive victims of divine whim or natural cycle, we are the architects of our own deluge. This places upon us a responsibility the Sumerians never had, the power to mitigate, to adapt, and to consciously shape what survives. Will we be the pre-flood civilization that fails to heed the warnings, or will we be the Ziusudras who preserve the knowledge and forge a sustainable path? The tablets don't give answers, but they frame the question in the longest terms possible. They tell us that civilizations are ephemeral, that the environment is paramount, and that the most important thing we can do is to ensure the survival of memory, the memory of what we are losing, and the memory of how we chose to respond. The rising tide we face is not just water, it is a test of whether we have learned the deepest lesson buried in the Sumerian clay. The tablets rest now in the silent, climate-controlled dusk of museum archives across the world, in London, in Baghdad, in Philadelphia. Their surfaces, etched with the precise wedge-shaped marks of a long-dead language, lie behind glass, shielded from the very elements that once shaped them, the sun that baked them, the hands that pressed them, the fires that hardened memory into permanence. The fingers that guided the stylus are dust, returned to the same Mesopotamian soil from which the clay was dug. The cities whose triumphs and traumas they chronicle, Uruk, Eridu, are mute mounds on a cracked plain, their ziggurats eroded to nubs, their streets buried under millennia of wind-blown silt. Yet, the memory endures. Not as a clear, linear history, but as a haunting echo, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, rewriting itself with every generation that leans over the glass case with a new question. Leonard Woolley saw in these fragments a triumphant confirmation, the physical amen to a biblical verse. Later archaeologists saw a complication, a stratigraphic riddle that appended simple origins. For us today, gazing across the chasm of 5,000 years while our own coastlines grow uncertain, these tablets may offer something else entirely, not a story about a single flood, but a profound allegory for human existence on a volatile planet. They are a cultural fossil, preserving not just an event, but the very psychology of catastrophe, the way memory layers, compresses, and seeks desperately for meaning in the wake of unimaginable loss. The journey from the trench to this understanding is a mirror of humanity's own struggle to comprehend deep time. Woolley's flood layer was real. The sterile silt was deposited by a colossal, terrifying inundation of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley around 2900 BC. That event undoubtedly entered local legend. But to stop there is to read only the headline and miss the epic novel. The deeper excavation revealed the Ubaid culture beneath, and the even deeper excavations at Eridu revealed a temple rebuilt 18 times, a sacred thread of continuity stretching back to 5400 BC. This is the first major lesson of the clay: civilization is not an event, but a process of stubborn persistence. Catastrophe is not a full stop, but a semicolon. The silt layer at Ur was a pause, a moment of profound trauma and loss, but above it and below it, life and culture regrouped, adapted, and continued. The Sumerians themselves were not the primordial survivors of a global deluge, they were the inheritors of a long, sophisticated pre-existing culture that had itself likely weathered multiple disasters. Their genius was not in invention from nothing, but in synthesis, codification, and breathtaking expression. This forces us to reinterpret the central message of their most famous myth. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the Eridu Genesis are not journalistic accounts. They are theological and philosophical masterpieces crafted from layered raw materials. The oldest layer is the primal, species-wide trauma of the post-glacial floods, the slow, inexorable drowning of continental shelves like the Persian Gulf oasis, events so vast and generational they reshaped the human world. This memory, carried orally for millennia by displaced populations, became archetypal, the Great Flood as a concept. The newer layer was the visceral, historical memory of the violent river floods that periodically devastated Mesopotamia. This layer provided specific, tangible details: the design of a coracle or barge, the name of a righteous king of Shuruppak, the nearby mountain of Nazur where the boat grounded. Over centuries, the two layers fused. The specific, local disaster became the vessel for the universal, ancestral trauma. The myth that resulted was potent precisely because it was both real and symbolic, both historical and cosmic. Its message was not "this happened once," but rather, "this is the kind of thing that happens." Water can bring life, and water can take everything away. Order is fragile, and chaos is always waiting at the edge of the irrigated field. This duality is etched into every aspect of Sumerian civilization, revealing the second great lesson of the clay: trauma, if survived and integrated, can become the engine of cultural complexity. Their entire worldview can be seen as a monumental response to the memory of flood. Their pantheon was structured around controlling chaotic forces. Enlil, the king of the gods, could order the flood in a fit of anger. Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom, could subvert that order to save humanity. This divine bureaucracy mirrored their own need for social order to hold back chaos. Their technology was dominated by water management. The intricate networks of canals, dikes, and shadufs were not merely agricultural tools, they were a daily, physical battle to control the very element that had once threatened to erase them. Their science was dedicated to discerning pattern in chaos. The obsessive astronomy, the meticulous omen reading, extispecie, the development of mathematics based on cyclical numbers, all were attempts to find predictable order in a universe that had proven itself capriciously violent. Even their architecture shouted their fear and their hope. The ziggurat was a symbolic mountain, the safe high ground from the flood, the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of creation, a stairway to the gods who controlled the waters. Every brick laid was a statement of defiance against the formless deep. The Sumerian king list, with its impossibly long antediluvian reigns, now reads not as bad history, but as a profound philosophical treatise on time. It encodes the understanding that the current world of short-lived kings and fragile city-states is a diminished, post-fall era. The fantastical millennia before the flood represent a lost age of stability, a golden age that was washed away. The flood is the hinge between that deep, mythic past and the historical, turbulent present. It is a way of saying, we are not the first, nor the greatest. We are what comes after the cataclysm. This humility is startling, and it contains the third lesson: civilizations are ephemeral, but the questions they grapple with are eternal. The Sumerians asked, why do we suffer catastrophe? How do we maintain order? What must we preserve to survive? They answered with gods, canals, and clay tablets. We ask the same questions, answering with climate models, seawalls, and digital servers. The medium changes, the existential struggle does not. And this brings us to the urgent, uncomfortable reflection we see in the polished glass over the tablet. We are living in a new age of rising waters. Our glaciers and ice sheets are melting, not from natural orbital cycles, but from the heat of our own civilization. The rate of sea level rise is accelerating, threatening to drown not just wilderness, but the greatest concentrations of human infrastructure, wealth, and population in history, our modern, global, coastal civilization. Like the inhabitants of the Gulf Oasis, we are a people of the shore facing an encroaching ocean. The reflection is precise, but the differences are critical and terrifying. The ancient refugees had space. An empty continent of fertile river valleys lay inland. Their migration, while traumatic, was geographically possible. Our world is full, demarcated by impassable political borders and home to billions. The migration of even a fraction of coastal populations would trigger conflicts and crises that make the Sumerian epic look like a local skirmish. Furthermore, the ancient flood was an act of nature or gods, a fate to be endured, a cycle to be accepted. Our coming flood is an act of our own making. We are both the victims and the architects. This changes everything. It grants us a terrifying responsibility the Sumerians never had, the power of foresight and the potential for mitigation. We are not simply awaiting a divine decree, we are writing the decree with every ton of carbon emitted. This makes the Sumerian lesson not one of passive fatalism, but of active, urgent legacy. They teach us what happens when a culture is defined by water trauma. It can lead to brilliant innovation, profound art, and a relentless drive for order. But they also show us the limits of that response. For all their canals, they could not stop the floods. For all their omens, they could not predict their own political collapse. They managed the symptom, not the cause. Our challenge is to manage the cause. The fourth and most vital lesson from the clay is about the stewardship of memory. The Sumerians' greatest gift to the future was not the wheel or the plow, but the written record. They pressed their story into clay so it would outlast them. They did this not for us, but for their own descendants, to say, this is who we are. This is what we feared. This is how we survived. In doing so, they performed the ultimate act of hope. They bet on the future. They bet that someone, someday, would care to read their marks. That act of preservation is what allows us to have this conversation across 50 centuries. What, then, is our equivalent act of preservation? As we face a transformation of our own making, what are we pressing into the equivalent of permanent clay? Our records are digital, stored on servers vulnerable to power loss, corruption, and obsolescence. Our culture is ephemeral, flowing in streams of data. The Sumerians remind us that survival is not just about physical continuity, but about the continuity of knowledge and warning. Are we ensuring that the core truths of our predicament, the science of climate change, the lessons of unsustainable growth, are inscribed in forms that can survive societal collapse, power outages, and the slow erosion of attention spans? Are we building our own ziggurats of knowledge that will stand as beacons to future generations, saying, we saw it coming? Here is what we knew. Learn from our failures and triumphs? The final wedge-shaped mark on a Sumerian tablet is not a period. It is an opening. A question pressed into clay. The story of Ziusudra ends with him granted eternal life, removed from the cyclical world of death and disaster. But for his descendants, the cycle continued. The tablets do not offer an escape from the cycle, they merely document its turn. The question they leave us with is, can the cycle be broken? Not by God's granting immortality to a chosen few, but by a collective species waking up to its own agency within the geological story. The message in the clay, when listened to with this deep time perspective, is a dialogue between past and future. The past whispers, we endured. We remembered. We built upon the silt of our disasters. The waters rose, and we moved our sacred huts to higher ground. Our world ended, and we began again, carrying the old stories into the new city. The future, looking back at our moment, will ask, what did they do when they saw the water coming? Did they just build higher walls on the same sinking shore? Or did they undertake the harder migration, not of people, but of mind and economy, away from the brink? The tablets in their cases are silent. The wind no longer scours their surfaces. But in their stillness, they scream a warning and offer a fragile hope. The warning is that civilizations that forget their vulnerability, that mistake their temporary order for permanent reality, are destined to become a layer of sterile silt for others to dig through. The hope is that the act of remembering, of inscribing the truth, of building not just for the present but for the deep future, is itself a form of salvation. The Sumerians, by giving us their flood story, handed us a mirror. In it, we see not their drowned world, but the reflection of our own, poised on the edge of the same rising tide. The choice is not whether the waters will change, they always do. The choice is what we will become in the process, a layer of loss, or the architects of a resilient, remembered future. If you enjoyed this journey through deep time, consider liking this video and subscribing for more historical deep dives. Drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from.